My God! They just can't seem to escape the worldwide leader in woke fast enough. Seems like every other day now, another on air talent is abandoning ESPN, jumping out of this marriage. And you gotta remember, all this is happening during a time when people are barely clinging to their jobs. ESPN's laid off hundreds of employees over the last 6 or 7 months. Over the last 5 years, they have laid off thousands of people. This seems almost unprecedented. Sure, we have seen people voluntarily leave ESPN in the past, but many times those were big stars. They weren't lesser known names like Diana Rossini or Sage Steele. If you look at the people who leave ESPN voluntarily, most of them have one thing in common. And this is going back 20 years to someone like Dan Patrick. This is going back 8 or 10 years to people like Colin Cowherd. When people leave ESPN on their own, they are leaving so they can be themselves. They are leaving for creative freedom. They are leaving so they can speak freely, be authentic. It's kind of ironic when you think about it. The network that is supposedly dedicated to fighting oppression is one of the most oppressive networks in the mainstream media. 10 or 20 years ago, I would imagine that it was a difficult decision to leave ESPN. I think Dan Patrick left in '06, maybe it was 2007. That decision had to be extremely difficult. Back then, if you were covering sports, if you were in sports talk radio, ESPN was the pinnacle. ESPN, that was the top of the mountain. Once you got there, you did everything you could to maintain your spot. When Colin Cowherd left in 2014 or 2015, I would imagine that was a tough decision to make. You're leaving the largest platform in sports media to go work at a startup? Here we are 8 years later with ESPN struggling to draw ratings, and FS1, they still have a quarter of the audience of the worldwide leader in woke. I saw an article the other day claiming for the first time in history FS1's available in more homes than ESPN. I mean, that's true, but they could be in double the homes. They still have 25% of the audience. It seems to be getting easier, though, for people to leave the worldwide leader in woke. Earlier this morning, we were informed that one of the last remaining normal people who are still working at ESPN, they announced this morning that they were leaving the network. Now, normal people are scarce at Woke U Bristol. You want to talk about marginalized groups? Normal people working at ESPN belong to a marginalized group. They are in the minority. You'll find plenty of shit fucks. You'll find plenty of wanker spankers. You can float down the river of tears from people crying about mythical racism. But if you tour the offices of ESPN, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who could accurately define a woman. Even the women working there struggle to define their gender identity. It is a traumatic experience for them when nature calls. They don't know whether to enter the gender-neutral restroom on the left or the porta potty on the right, which is serviced daily by the dump divers in the WNBA. This latest departure from ESPN should come as a surprise to no one. As soon as Sage Steele filed that lawsuit last spring, I think it was, everyone knew her days at ESPN were numbered. Now, I thought this lawsuit was interesting because I could see both sides here. Now, for those that don't know, Sage Steele filed a lawsuit against ESPN last year, claiming they were infringing on her First Amendment rights. Now, for people watching me who choose to identify as a shitfuck, the First Amendment, it grants all Americans the right to free speech. Now, look, I am not a defender of ESPN, but I understood where they were coming from. If you're running a television network that is dedicated to filth, well, KC, I thought ESPN was dedicated to sports. You thought wrong. ESPN hasn't been dedicated to sports in years. If I turn on ESPN tomorrow night, I don't know if I'm getting Wednesday Night Baseball or a dramatic documentary on the plight of the WNBA dump diver. Join us tonight on ESPN for this exclusive story where the abortion rights of a trash collector and her wife were infringed upon by the evil white man. Dump diver Debbie's wife, Ronald, wanted to terminate the pregnancy at 17 months, but the evil state of Texas said that That is illegal. If you're running a network that's abiding by the standards of Woke United Methodist, you don't want one of your lead anchors on SportsCenter speaking truth publicly and completely undermining your narrative. When Sage Steele was collecting money from ESPN, she was a representative of the company. Whether it was on the set of SportsCenter or on Jay Cutler's podcast, Sage Steele was representing ESPN. When she's introduced, they don't say, "This is Sage Steele." They say, "This is Sage Steele from ESPN." Now, from that perspective, I understood where ESPN was coming from, but at the same time, I also understood where Sage Steele was coming from. Just because I work for you, just because you pay me, it doesn't give you the right to silence me. Sure, I've got to abide by your rules when I'm on your airwaves, but when I'm making appearances outside of your network, I should have the right to do and say whatever the hell I want. It's kind of a gray area, especially with public figures. The problem, though, I have with ESPN, and I believe this was Sage Steele's point of contention too, ESPN is selective with who they silence. The network dedicated to diversity does not practice diversity when it comes to silencing people. Stephen A. Smith, he's allowed to have a podcast outside the ESPN family of networks where he can say whatever the fuck he wants. Elle Duncan's allowed to hijack SportsCenter and lecture an audience consisting mostly of men on the importance of their rights to have an abortion, even though 100% of the men watching will never need an abortion. Malika Andrews can interrupt coverage of the NBA to highlight the evils of toxic masculinity. But when Sage Steele says she was uncomfortable with Disney forcing the Fauci on her, she gets suspended. The truth is, the network dedicated to combating mythical racism, they have been mistreating Sage Steele for years. Now, even though I am very familiar with Sage Steele, I wanted to double check this morning to make sure that she was still black. I found a recent picture of her. Yeah, Sage Steele, black woman. But KC, she's actually biracial. She's got a white mother. Yeah, that's true, but look at me. And look at Sage Steele. You tell me who is lacking the most melanin. Unless you're colorblind, the answer is simple. There's a reason I'm pointing this out, though. Sage Steele is a beautiful black woman. I think the proper term amongst parishioners at Woke United Methodist is Sage Steele's a beautiful black queen. Either way, beautiful black woman. ESPN, they put on this public front that they are leading the fight against mythical racism. If that's true, if that's really the case, how come they've spent the last 3, maybe 4 years treating Sage Steele like shit? 3 years ago, during the height of the riots in the summer of 2020, the network supposedly dedicated to sports, they were putting together a special on mythical racism here in America. I believe they were calling it a town hall or something like that. They were looking for on-air talent at ESPN to be a part of the special. They needed people like Kirk Herbstreit to apologize for their white privilege and cry like a kindergartner that just shit his pants live on the air. They needed people like Ryan Clark to share fabricated stories about being a victim of mythical racism. ESPN also wanted Sage Steele to be a part of this special. At the last minute, executives at ESPN, they suddenly changed their mind. Why? Because Elle Duncan pushed to have Sage Steele excluded. What was her reasoning? Sage Steele won't be accepted by the black community. Since when did Elle Duncan become the expert on who is accepted by the black community? Fast forward to 2021, Ryan Clark outright refused to work with Sage Steele. Why? Sage Steele says bad things about Daddy Fauci. As a grade A shitfuck and a confirmed beta male, I refuse to work with a biological woman. What did executives at ESPN do about this? Absolutely nothing. Sage Steele was treated as an outsider at the worldwide leader in woke. She was one of the only people, one of the only people who were willing to speak out against the bullshit, and she was demonized for it. Several months ago, ESPN tried to settle the lawsuit with Sage Steele for about $500,000. Now, initially, she turned them down. She said that she was not going to be silenced for an amount of money. Eventually, though, The lawsuit was quietly settled. Sage Steele received an undisclosed amount. Now, you can look at this one of two ways. You can say Sage Steele went back on her word and accepted money for being silenced. Or you could just say Sage Steele wanted this to end so she could finally gain her freedom from ESPN. Me personally, I choose to believe the latter. This case was going to drag out in court for years. Sage Steele couldn't say anything while the case was ongoing, which is a death sentence for someone working in the mainstream media, out of sight, out of mind. When she announced that she was leaving ESPN this morning, Sage Steele said something I thought was interesting. She took one final shot at the worldwide leader in woke. Sage Steele, she said her reason for leaving ESPN was so she could finally exercise her right to free speech. Translation: I can finally be authentic. I can finally be who I am. Like I said earlier, it's the same reason Dan Patrick left, same reason Colin Cowherd left. I would assume same reason Diana Rossini left. I'm sure that there are others that I'm forgetting about, but when people voluntarily leave ESPN, the reason most often given is freedom. You cannot be free working at ESPN. It's just not possible. When Stephen A. Smith eventually leaves, I guarantee you, he is going to say the same thing. ESPN gave him shit because he had Clay Travis on his podcast. Do not be surprised when Stephen A. Smith leaves ESPN. Do not be surprised when Pat McAfee has problems with management at ESPN. I think the next person to leave is going to be Sam Ponder. I was actually surprised that Sam Ponder wasn't included in the layoffs. This is going to keep happening. We're going to continue to see high-profile names leaving ESPN voluntarily. People do not respond well to oppression. After a while, the money is just no longer worth it. What's that old saying from the Bible? What good is having all the money in the world if you forfeit your soul for it, or something like that? What good is collecting millions of dollars from ESPN if you're being forced into being something that you're not? Give me your thoughts. Sage Steele leaves ESPN, throws one final shot at them along the way. Who is next? Who is next to leave ESPN so they can be authentic? Stephen A? Sam Ponder? Someone I'm forgetting? You let me know. Sound off in the comments below. Make sure to like and subscribe. Click the notification bell to receive all notifications from the channel. Best way to contact me is by email at btlkc84@gmail.com, KC_BTL84 on Twitter. I'll see you guys later.